This episode of BioPOD includes images and videos of artwork mentioned in the interview. To get the best experience, we recommend that you view the video version of this episode on our YouTube channel, linked in the show notes. Enjoy!
Hello and welcome to BioPOD, the official podcast for the School of Biological Sciences here at the University of Edinburgh. I'm Felix, and in today's episode, BioPOD's own Anna sits down with Dr. Keira Tucker to talk about the ASCUS Lab and its role in communicating the outcomes of scientific research to the general public. So now, over to you, Anna.
Hello, Keira. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. So we are currently in the building of Summer Hall where ASCUS Art Science is located. We've just had a tour of the lab itself. So would you like to tell us a bit about what ASCUS Lab and ASCUS Art and Science is?
Yeah, absolutely. So ASCUS Art and Science is a non-profit organization dedicated to bridging the gap between the arts and the sciences. The two can often be seen as very separate entities. And ASCUS Art and Science founded the ASCUS Lab in 2015. We applied for some funding from the Wellcome Trust, which was successful. And then in 2016, we opened the doors to the ASCUS Lab, which is an interdisciplinary science art lab. So we have a lot of artists that come in and use the space. We provide training on the equipment, such as microscopes, microbiology equipment, DNA analysis equipment, and a range of other things for people to be able to kind of get a hands-on feel for science, what it entails, and also explore their projects further.
So how is this different from an institutional laboratory, for example?
So our lab is completely separate from any institution. We're not affiliated to any university. And oftentimes there's a lot of red tape when it comes to going into a science lab, part of an institution. And our lab, we don't have that. That's not to say we take safety less seriously. We absolutely do. Anyone coming into our space needs to undergo a health and safety induction. But our space is it's a private space that's not affiliated to any institution. So we're able to not cut corners, but we're able to help people that normally would be needing to register as a student to access a science lab, for example.
Yeah, I think this concept of an open access lab is can be very foreign to most people that move maybe in the space of academia or are students in an academic institutions like the University of Edinburgh, for example. So, and you were also you also come from an academic background. Is that true?
Yes, I did, and I don't know if I'll go back there, but yeah.
So what is your academic background?
So I have a PhD in microbiology. Preceding that, I did my undergrad was in physiology with a second major in microbiology. So kind of a little bit of human and then a little bit of micro. I ended up really enjoying microbiology as a subject. The concept of having these invisible things all around us really fascinated me. So I kind of pursued that. And my PhD was more in environmental microbiology rather than clinical microbiology. So I was looking at antibiotic resistance in river water and how that affects the environment. So yeah, that's kind of my academic, very theoretical background.
Your PhD was in the University of Edinburgh, right?
No, so I'm originally from South Africa, and so I did my PhD at the University of Stellenbosch.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. How did you then get into Edinburgh from South Africa?
It's a long-winded story, but I followed my heart. So my husband, my now husband, my then fiance was, he's just finished his PhD. So he got a scholarship to come and do his PhD at the University of Edinburgh. I was in the middle of my PhD, so we had a little bit of distance, and then I joined him eventually once I'd got my degree.
Okay, right. Very cool.
Yeah.
So if a person from an academic background was to walk into ASCUS labs, what might be their first impression, you think?
That's a really interesting one. I think on their firstly looking around the lab, they would be like, this is a really small lab and it's really different to what they're used to. The usual traditional science labs at a university are like a long bench, and either if you're lucky and you have a relatively small amount of people in your lab, you might have that whole bench to yourself, or you might need to share that bench, in which case in ours would be quite similar. But yeah, I think they'd probably look around and be a little bit like, oh, this is like familiar but also unfamiliar. There's paint like all over the floor in the lab, so they might be a little bit unsettled that it's it's not the sterile lab environment that
we've
most
just
people see.
Had a tour, and I quite liked the sort of dark academia but messy aesthetic, because like wooden benches with scratches on everywhere. It's in Summer Hall, so it's a very old space.
Very old, yeah.
What led you then from a PhD to such an unsettling lab space?
So I've always been torn between the creatives and this sort of science part of my brain, I think. When I was in school, I wanted to follow music as my career. I wanted to be a film composer, and the only reason I didn't follow that route is because the university I applied for lost my application. And then I was kind of in this position where I needed to do something with my life.
Gosh.
I ended up in science. That's not to say I didn't like science. I absolutely loved it. I was torn between the two always. And I think when I was at that kind of school leaving level, there wasn't this sort of interdisciplinary approach to things. Like you had to pick one or the other. And I still think a lot of people feel that way. I kind of trudged my way through the degrees, and at the end of my PhD, I was exhausted mentally and physically of just what comes next, because I think when you go down the route of biology, and this is just my personal opinion, it's not to put anyone off, it's kind of, you get your undergrad, and then in South Africa you get your honours, and then you get your masters, and then you get your PhD, and then you're either a postdoc or you go to industry, or you're kind of like, well, now what? Because my next step isn't there, so now what do I do? Towards the end of my PhD, I used to au pair a lot and do babysitting to kind of just bring in extra money to fund the PhD.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed music, so I taught guitar and piano. And some of the children I babysat for really struggled with their science at school, so I would then teach them songs to remember the science stuff. And their parents kind of said to me, like, you should do this. This is really cool. Our kids are doing really well in school now. I was like, okay, cool. Like, maybe there's a way to combine the arts with the sciences. And then COVID hit and things happened. My move to Edinburgh happened, and this job that I now have was advertised. And I was like, this is literally the job that was made for me. Like, this is perfect. It's creative. It's scientific. It teaches. It's everything. So yeah, that's kind of how I ended up here. I was very lucky that I applied for it and I got the job.
And now you are the manager. Now
I'm the manager. There is, because we're a non-profit, we apply for funding and things like that to keep going. COVID hit us really hard, so since then we haven't really had the funds to get anyone else on board. So I've kind of had to steer the ship and do my best to kind of keep everything going. You're pretty much the only one on the leading team right now, aren't you? Yes. So I'm supported by 4 directors that are on the ASCUS board. But in terms of core staff, it is really just me. So it's tough, but I've definitely learned a lot. So yes, I'm technically the manager, but I'm also the lab technician and everybody else. So yeah. And then you have events throughout the year, talks, workshops, art exhibitions,
And you have collaborated with the University of Edinburgh on some of those. So I thought we could talk about those a little bit today. When I was browsing your website, the first one that caught my eye was this project called Glands, which is a play on words, from what I understand, on the word gland. And I really liked sort of the take of the artist on that. So I will just read this little paragraph that Emily, the artist, has written about it, which is: Osiris, our protagonist, our salivary gland, who lives in the glands, located everywhere and nowhere all at once. Osiris is your gland and mine. Will you join us on this out-of-body experience? So she's talking about this Osiris, who is an Egyptian god?
From what I understand, yes.
An Egyptian god of afterlife?
Yeah.
Is that correct? So, this was a crazy connection to me. Do you want to talk us through how Emily explored this connection?
Absolutely. This is one of my favorite projects since I've been with ASCUS. So Emily approached Dr. Emerson. Elaine Emerson is a researcher, like you mentioned. She is trying to understand how to restore salivary gland function. So I'll maybe provide some context in that people who have head and neck cancer, part of their treatment is radiotherapy. And if you think of your head and your neck, it's a very niche area to have cancer, where you have radiotherapy, which could affect your head, it could affect many parts of your head and neck. Oftentimes in radiotherapy, your salivary glands, which are located here, and I think down here in your neck, they get damaged through the radiotherapy, and then either they are no longer functional. And this was a huge, even coming from a scientific background, I knew nothing about this, so I learned a lot during this project. But you think about how much you need saliva. You need it to talk, you need it to swallow, you need it to eat. So if these glands are not producing saliva, you can't do any of those functions, which has a huge impact on your quality of life. If you can't eat your favorite foods, you can't communicate to your spouse or your friends, you can't swallow, it's a huge impact. So Elaine's work is about trying to restore the function of a damaged salivary gland, and so they often get donated samples from people who have had their glands removed because they're no longer functional, and then Elaine's lab does research on them to try and see if they can figure out how to restore the function. So Emily was super interested in kind of following the salivary gland once it had been removed from the person. The person is still alive and now well because they've undergone the treatment and it was successful, so they are cancer survivors. But she was really interested in this concept of this gland now exists outside of the body. What happens to it? Where does it go? So Emily, she's a wonderful person. She got her hands into the Emerson lab to kind of shadow what they do. She also was able to then try a little bit about what they do. She reached out to some pathologists and surgeons. So pathologists would get a biopsy of someone's organs or their salivary gland and see it is cancerous, and they would diagnose the cancer, and then the surgeon would potentially remove anything that needed to be removed.
So people that have different experiences of salivary glands from different perspectives.
Yes. So yeah, she was just kind of interested in following Osiris, the god of the afterlife, in the afterlife, to kind of see what would happen to it and how it ended up from someone's body into Dr. Emerson's research lab.
I think that's quite an unusual request to receive. I can imagine from a PI's perspective, for example, an artist coming up and saying, "Oh, I want to make drawings about your work," or something like that.
Yeah.
Do you do you find that the PIs that you work with are a specific sort of kind of scientist, or is there something about these people, these researchers, that makes them just more open to exploring their science from a less maybe scientific background?
I think in the context of GLANs, yes, the scientist there either has a reason for ending up as a scientist in a particular field. There's a driver, they might have had a family member that had head and neck cancer or was affected by this condition of dry mouth, which then it kind of inspired them to want to find a cure or a treatment for it. So then getting an email or a reach out is kind of inspiring that there's other people that are maybe in the same boat. So both Emily and Elaine had a link to head and neck cancer. Both of them had a family member who was affected by it. And so I feel like they were able to connect on that front. I do remember Emily saying that the first thing she wanted to do was go to Elaine's house. So she invited herself there, and just to kind of chat to her and see can they get on, can they work together, can this work, and it did, which is awesome. So yeah, and in other projects I find that the PI has, ulterior motive isn't the right word, but they have like a passion for the work that they're doing. And that's not to say that PIs not interested in the arts don't have passion. They definitely do. There is obviously limitations in people's times, the funding that they have available. So yeah, I do find that the people that agree to collaborations tend to have like a personal connection, not personal connection, like a personal thing in common with the artist that then kind of allows them to connect, and then they're able to collaborate in a better way. The other side of things is that a lot of grants require public engagement aspect to them. So in the context of this, which is not really what happened, but well, it did have a public engagement element to it, but that's not why the collaboration happened. If someone reaches out and it seems peculiar, it might be like, well, actually, I have to fulfill this part of my grant anyway, so this is worth my time to collaborate with this person. So I think, yeah, there's kind of two streams there.
Also, this issue seems like it affects quite a lot of people, and the effect is quite negative, and people care about it. So maybe that also helps to get the funding.
Absolutely. The sort of outcome of the project, which we'll kind of work our way there, I suppose, but one of the really important things for Elaine was getting people who had lived experience of this condition to then feed back to the funders to say, this is important to people. We need to be researching this. You need to keep funding us because it has a direct link to help people. So there's definitely this two-way collaboration, which is really cool.
Okay, so how did this collaboration actually work out? What sorts of artworks did Emily produce along the way? How was the Emerson Lab involved in that?
So the collaboration started in the Emerson Lab, as far as I understand, and the artist Emily kind of shadowed some of Dr. Emerson's researchers, so her master's PhD students. She kind of watched them in the lab. One of her and she made these beautiful sketches, and Emily has a very distinct style of drawing. I love her style. So she'll draw a scientist, for example, and there's a very it's kind of like my favorite drawing she's done, which is two scientists, their backs are towards her, and she's dotted the outline of their lab coats. And through the lab coats, I hope this makes sense while I'm talking, through the lab coats, she then drew what was kind of in front of them. So their tubes and their pipettes and all their scientific equipment. And that was sort of in the middle of her residency in the lab. Before that, she drew an image, the exact same image, but the lab coats were not transparent and she couldn't see through them. So that was a really great analogy for me, as from an artist's perspective, that previously when she first stepped foot in the lab, she didn't understand anything about what the scientists were doing. Their lab coats were kind of a barrier between her and what they were doing, and she didn't know anything. They were just adding liquids to tubes, and that was it. And then the one that she kind of dotted out the lab coat, and then you could see through the lab coats, was kind of breaking down that barrier and understanding a little bit more about what's happening behind the scenes. So that's she basically created a bunch of sketches which portrayed her journey learning about what the Emerson lab does. She did a bit of hands-on things. So a common thing we do in the lab is, we call it running a gel. In essence, it's looking at DNA and making sure it is what you expect, or if you're looking for specific genetic markers, that you are getting those markers. And it's normally on quite a small scale, so it requires a lot of dexterity for you to be able to put the DNA into the gel. And Emily was quite intrigued by this.
Yeah,
and she said,
I think a lot of academics have experience with that.
Exactly. So Emily was quite interested in, what if you just put ink in? Like, does it have to be DNA that goes in the gel? And from Dr. Emerson's point of view, she was like, I've never tried, let's try it. So it created this really beautiful gel that then eventually dried out and is now stuck on Elaine's pinboard, I think, just as like it's an interesting concept. Like, you've never really thought as a scientist about putting anything else in a gel besides a protein or DNA, depending on the type of gel that you're running. So yeah, they did a little bit of a hands-on thing as well. And then from the lab, I'm potentially speaking about this the wrong way around, because then Emily went to the surgeons and she witnessed some surgeries, so that potentially happened before the lab work. But there as well, she did a bunch of sketches, and over time then she worked with some, this came a bit later, people that had been affected by head and neck cancer, and this is kind of where ASCUS started coming in a little bit more. Emily worked with these people who had recovered but were affected by dry mouth, to create artworks with them. And so some of the artwork was then finally exhibited as part of the science festival. Was a combination of Emily's artworks that she had done, her sketches, and some beautiful paintings. So one of the walls, she had painted, if you can imagine, like a huge wall. She had painted one of her smaller sketches of the lab onto this giant wall, so that when you walked into the room, you were this like tiny little being inside this giant sort of lab. And the idea of that was like, you were the salivary gland and you were being scrutinized and experimented on. So the one room was kind of all about the lab, and she had her sketchbook from the lab there, and she invited attendees of the exhibition to kind of flip through that, and there were some gloves there as well, so it kind of had, like, you put on the gloves to flip through the lab book, which was her sketchbook. There were also some images of Elaine's work, so they use fluorescent stains to look at the salivary gland under the microscope to see certain things. So there was some of that imagery on that particular room. And then, yeah, it was a combination of the artwork that she had done with some of the cancer survivors, and that was really moving. So the one room was a poem by one of the people, and she had undergone radiotherapy and was now clean of cancer. So she wrote a poem about like the fear around it, and what was really like moving, and I have goosebumps now with like just thinking about it, is the radiotherapy mask that they have to wear. So because of the importance of where the cancer is located, any sort of misdirection, if you had to have a hiccup or move your head ever so slightly, it would then get the radio treatment in the wrong place, and that would be detrimental to your health and other aspects.
So it can be like in the jaw or lower down.
The jaw, your salivary glands, your neck. So anything here, and if you think of it's, I think, a laser kind of thing. So if that had to hit your eye or something, like it's not great. So your head has to stay 100% still. And so they mold a piece of plastic around your face that then is kind of screwed into a desk or a bench surface.
So you're sort of laying on your back,
exactly,
with this piece of plastic
holding your head 100% in place. And because it's molded to your face, its profile looks like you. So the two individuals that Emily worked with both had their masks like on the walls of the exhibition space. And that was just really profound, because you think, you know, there's multiple people who have had to undergo this. It's incredibly potentially triggering for some people who, even for the artists themselves that graciously said, yes, you can use the mask as part of your exhibition. It's really interesting, and some people who we worked with later on in the project have this very not so great relationship with their mask. So you basically at the end of your treatment you have the option to keep it or not. And these two
right. I was
going
to ask,
it, and
do you
others
keep it?
Absolutely did not want to keep it because of all the memories it brought up. So it was just a really interesting concept. So yeah, that was the second two rooms of that exhibition, and then the final room was sketches of the surgeries.
So this is from when Emily was present in those surgeries, and these are like her impressions of them?
Yeah, so they were also covered by a sheet of paper, so you could be as, you could lift them up very gently and you could peek in, because obviously it's graphic, so she didn't want people to, you could basically walk around the room and see as much or as little as you wanted to see. And there was then also something about cabbages, which I know sounds really unusual, but I think this is where the project in Emily's mind stemmed from originally. Was she did a residency at the Museum of Loss and Renewal, and there were these really old cabbages, and she thought that they looked like brains. And if you think of a cabbage with its root system,
kind of does.
It does look like a brain and the brainstem. She also then made these sculptures made from bone china of a cabbage, which then was a brain, to kind of link that between the Museum of Loss and Renewal to this project that she now had. So yeah, that was kind of a very long-winded way of saying the artwork that Emily produced over the course of the project, and it was influenced by those two participants that she worked with, but also we ran some public workshops that we got some people to contribute to the artworks through.
Yeah, I saw that on the website there was a workshop called Saliva Sessions, right? What was that one about?
So there were two of those sessions. The one was kind of a pilot workshop to test it out with people to get their feedback on it and then see if we could run it with members of the public. And so that was the second time we ran it. So the first time was with the people that Emily had originally identified as people to work with. So it was the people that she had worked with to generate the artwork for part of the science festival. And it was also very much their support system. So it was not only the people who had the cancer, but also their spouse, partner, whoever supported them through their cancer treatment and their journey. So that was really interesting because you get the two perspectives of the person going through the cancer and what it means to them, and the person supporting someone through cancer and almost just as impactful it is to that person in different ways, obviously. So those workshops were designed to try and get the people with lived experience of the cancers aware that research is being done to try and help them. So all of the people with the lived experience of cancer, well, not all of them, I think most of them, I should say rather, had the dry mouth side effect, so they couldn't swallow. I mean, some of them are like at a different part of their journey. So some could, some couldn't. They were all at different stages. Some were still kind of dealing with emotional trauma. Some had kind of come to terms with it and worked their way through that. So that was an interesting dynamic. But the idea behind the workshops was to provide like a hands-on kind of informal setting to give the patients, call them, an opportunity to speak with a researcher that's working on a problem that they struggle with. And then also having Emily there as like a creative kind of outlet, that it's not just, oh, I'm talking to a scientist now. It was a very informal approach. And so, yeah, there was this kind of three-way dialogue happening, and then kind of to get people talking and interested, because it's very difficult sometimes depending on how good of a science communicator someone is. Yeah, like people potentially forget how much they know about a certain topic, and it might be that boundary that Emily was trying to kind of get through of the lab coats. Someone knows more than me, I'm less important than them, or I'm not going to ask questions because I feel intimidated by them, or that kind of thing. And that's not to say that anyone we work with is intimidating. It's just people tend to have that perception. So where ASCUS in the lab comes in was that we helped design workshops that would be hands-on, enough hands-on that's similar to what Elaine and her lab does. So we extracted DNA from saliva, for example, in a very
the classic experiment.
Exactly. And then we also then did like a staining experiment. So for those that maybe don't know, if you have a tissue, it oftentimes light just penetrates right through it. So it's very difficult to see under a microscope. So you need to stain it in order to visualize it. And so Elaine's lab stains the glands quite a lot. So it was something that they do on a day-to-day basis that then the people attending the workshop got to experience, and they got to do it for themselves. So they kind of, that barrier slowly started to break down. They felt more like they knew a little bit more about what Elaine did, and each step or each activity that we did sparked questions that Elaine could then answer. And so, yeah, it's just a really great way to get people to not feel so intimidated by what they don't know. There's always that saying of, I don't know what I don't know, so I don't know what questions to ask.
Yes.
By giving them a little bit of an insight into what happens, then they're able to kind of, feel more on an equal playing field. So those workshops were amazing.
Moving on to your second project, out of this small selection of projects that we are talking about today, called Following the Noise, Interdisciplinary Conversations, Shedding Light on Perspective. So this was a collaboration between two scientific researchers and one artistic researcher. As you described, the artist also as a kind of a researcher in this blog post that I read on your website, which I thought was interesting. So this collaboration, how did it, what was it about first of all?
So this collaboration was, we had worked with the scientific researchers before, Richard and Cecile, on a this was pre my time working with ASCUS, but it was kind of like a snow art residency. So they were interested in seeing how artists would respond to their data. So we had worked with them before, and as far as I know, they were interested in working with another artist, or just trying to bring people of different fields together and chatting, basically.
Yeah, these scientists were in the area of geosciences, weren't they?
That's correct, yes. So they are both snow scientists in layman's terms, I think, and they look at the impact of I hope I'm saying this correctly, but the sun's trajectory in the sky and how that might impact the snow melting and what that means for us in the context of climate change. And so their sort of modus operandi is taking a hemispherical image, so taking a camera, putting it on the floor of a forest or any open space or whichever area they're interested in, and then they would take a picture and you get a kind of a spherical image from the ground up.
Yeah, I think I saw one of these on the blog post as well. So the website is definitely a good place to check what that looks like. It was very interesting.
Yeah, so you'd see sort of trees coming from, so you basically get a circular image that then you've got trees or whatever's in the skyline on the outside of that image, and then on the inside you see the sky. And they're able to then see the sun's trajectory through that. So they use pixels as an indication of light coming through the forest canopy or whatever their area is.
Right, so more light pixels would mean more sun was getting through on that particular day.
Yes, and if you're in a very shaded area, then it's a darker pixel, so then they count that as not allowing sunlight through, so it would be potentially a place that less melting is occurring.
So they went on a field trip together, is that correct, to Blackford Glen?
Yeah, so after we had like a couple of sit-down sessions and everyone was just talking. So Cecile and Richard talked about what they did, how they collect data. Victoria Evans, who's the artist, was kind of talking about her practice. And then, after a few sessions, then they thought, I actually need to see in practice what it is that you do. So they went to Blackford, and Richard and Cecile kind of showed Victoria what they were doing, how they would collect data, how they would choose sites to investigate and things like that.
And then something happened with one of the images that sparked a particular interest from the artist, right?
Yes. So this wasn't on the Blackford field trip, but in one of the images that the scientists were showing the artist, they said that they would have discarded a particular image because of noise. And in the context of science, most of us know that noise is just irrelevant data. That's not what we're looking for. But then the artist was like, noise, but it's an image. Like, how is there noise there? So then they explained that there was a mosquito that had landed on the lens of the camera. And if they are looking at dark pixels being things that block out light, the mosquito on the lens of the camera is blocking out light and is counted as a dark pixel, so it is providing inaccurate information based on what they're looking for, and it, in the context of melting of snow, where the mosquito is located on the lens isn't actually going to cause snow melting, so they needed to discard that image because it wasn't accurate. And the artist was highly interested in this because what is a mosquito doing in, I think this particular location was in Lapland, and she was kind of thinking what are mosquitoes doing there.
Yeah, very north up. Yeah.
Exactly. And so then the scientist was kind of like, I didn't really think about that. But that's because I'm not really interested in mosquitoes, or like my area of interest and expertise and what I have funding for is to do this specific thing. Yeah. So anything that has anything that's not what I'm looking for, it's going to get discarded.
And I must, adhere to this method because that's what I'm being paid for.
Exactly. And also like I have specific aims and objectives that I need to achieve.
Right.
and the artist was it was really interesting because there's similarities between art and science. There are also very huge differences, and one of the big differences I feel is that science is kind of objective driven. You need an output, you need to know what you're looking for. Whether or not you find it is a different story, but you need to know what your end product or goal is. Whereas art is very process based. So it's kind of following the noise. That's an interesting thing. You got a mosquito on your lens. Let's investigate that. Don't worry about what you actually applied for funding. Let's go down this rabbit hole. So that was kind of the synopsis of that collaboration, was just the conversation between very different backgrounds that have similarities, have differences, and the approach both of them would take on a particular image.
Do you think it changed slightly how the scientists were collecting data after, or how they went about testing their primary hypothesis, do you think?
I think it's potentially sparked something in them. I did ask one of the researchers this question, and yeah, the thing is they would love to follow the noise. They would love to go down the rabbit holes, but time constraints and funding, and they often, like, something they also raised was they get to go to some of the most beautiful but almost inhabitable parts of the world, technically for free on like grants to do research. And oftentimes they forget about just how beautiful that is, that some people will never see those places in their lifetime. So it's kind of made her appreciate that concept a little bit more. Whether or not it's changed their approach to the science that they do, I'm not so sure, because it is in the end sort of funding driven. But it maybe is, it has sparked something that, you know, don't discard the images, just put them in a separate folder and maybe come back to them in a different funding period where, you know, it is important to think about why the mosquitoes are there, or what that means in the context of your data or something like that. So yes and no.
Yeah. Okay, and then moving on to the project that has the latest updates. That is the Surface Echoes project, where you work with people suffering from eczema. So first of all, why did you name this project Surface Echoes? I thought that was quite an interesting name.
So this was a collaborative effort. So I'll mention up front, so we're working with Professor Sarah Brown, who's a dermatologist and an academic researcher. So she works both as part of the NHS as a clinician, and also then she's a academic researcher. And she's interested in the genetic influences that might predispose someone to getting eczema. Then there's Beverly Hood, who is an artist working at the Edinburgh College of Art, which is part of the University of Edinburgh. And then there's Dee Davison, who is a public outreach person. And then we're working with a research assistant as well, Alison Main. So it was a joint effort to name the project, all of us together. The project originally started, it was called 2000 Voices. And the point of this was there is a lot of quotes from people who have eczema or their carers who have kind of dealt with what it's like living with someone that has eczema. And all these quotes are buried away in academic journals that only people who know about them are going to read. And so
this is academics going around and interviewing these people with the specific objective of trying to find a cure or whatever for eczema, but like it's an academic objective.
Yes. So these were kind of can see I've been out of academia for a while.
Like observation studies.
It was like a review article,
right,
on a range of different
or systematic review, maybe something like that.
So these Professor Sarah Brown kind of has come across these papers because she is in that field, but anyone else wouldn't really be able to see these quotes. And so she thought these quotes are really important and they need to be out in the public. How can we make it more public? So it's basically there are hundreds of these research papers with the quotes. So that's where 2000 kind of came from. And the voices are the voices of the people living with eczema. So that's originally where 2000 voices came from. So when the project originally kind of was conceived, that was the idea. When it received funding, everyone sort of thought it sounded a little bit like a choir. And like it wouldn't like there were already projects that were like 1,000 voices or something like that. And so surface echoes came around because a lot of the quotes that were from these papers were echoing each other, and it was people saying, I've got the same problem. My problem is, for example, the creams that the doctor prescribes me don't work. And many people said this. So that was kind of where echoes came from.
Right, and it's all looked up in this academic journal, which you probably have to pay for to read.
Exactly. And then the surface comes from, obviously, because your skin is on your surface, and also trying to bring all these quotes and this knowledge to the surface of like the public realm rather than it being buried away. So surface echoes came around.
Right. So there's a number of workshops that were part of this project. Well, it started back in 2021, is that right? And sort of the latest project that I could find on your website was in February this year. Mm-hmm. So do you want to give us maybe like a quick rundown of the workshops before and tell us a bit more about the project, about the workshop that happened in February?
Both of the workshops are designed with the intent to create more awareness about eczema, and that the artwork that will be produced at the end of this project hopefully will have that goal achieved. So the first workshop was geared towards university students, a slightly older cohort. And it was really interesting because even though they all have the same condition, they all experience it very, very differently. And you get very mild versions of eczema and you get very severe versions of eczema. There's an emotional aspect that comes with that. There is a mental aspect that comes with that. A lot of people think eczema is just itchy skin or like dry skin, and that's not it at all. For people who have very severe eczema, it's so itchy that you're scratching yourself until you bleed, which then makes you prone to infections. It's so itchy that it keeps you up all night so that you can't work the next day because you're so exhausted because it's every single night, all night. A lot of the times eczema is sort of a flare-up condition, so you might be in a really bad state one day, you might call up the GP, they will say, cool, I can see you in a week's time, and in a week's time your condition's kind of, I wouldn't say gone away, but it's lowered itself. Mm-hmm. So you go to the GP, they say there's nothing wrong with you, and that's incredibly invalidating for someone who's just experienced a week of nightmarish hell. Yeah. So it's kind of understanding that, and even amongst people that have eczema, some people experience that, other people don't experience that. Some people find that certain creams really do work for them, others say it's really difficult to find something that works to calm their symptoms. So it's really interesting, and that was the point of the first workshop.
So this was you just talking to the university students?
Yeah, and we also, so the research assistant, Alison, designed some kind of creative tools to get people thinking about certain themes, what it means for them. So we had made, from the research papers, we had extracted some quotes, and some of the tasks were, how well or like how closely can you relate to the statement. And there were some kind of target boards. Yes, I relate right in the middle. No, I don't relate, towards the outskirts of the target. And so from that we can kind of gather what direction we should go in. So,
there was this workshop where the participants were working with text, sort of cutting up text. Was that which workshop was that part of?
So that was the second one, and this is kind of the direction that this project is now going towards. Rather than it being a visual arts piece, it's kind of taking the form of a script. So more of like a performance art piece. And the idea behind this is that it's very interesting. And when the project started, I didn't really think this, but once we kind of got into the nitty-gritty of it, if you're listening to something, you perceive it in a different way to if you're reading it in your head or if you're reading it out loud. And so it was kind of, if you read something on a website, oh, that's such a shame that people experience this condition. That's so sad for those people. And you move on with your life. Whereas if someone maybe talks to you about it, or you can hear the emotion in their voice, or you're reading it out loud, the words just hit differently. So the idea behind the text is that we have these quotes written in journals, and then we also got some quotes from the workshops that we would run. So does it mean something different if you cut it up and reposition the word order? Like, does that change things? And so a lot of it was really interesting because there were two different dynamics. There were some people that were quite positive about their condition and it's a part of who I am. Without eczema, I wouldn't be me. And there's some people that saying this is ruining my life. I'm really struggling. And I can't live with this. And then we also work with some performance artists who it was an interesting exercise. So they would read out these quotes from the papers, and it was in the region of, some people would have instructions. So the instructions might have been whisper or jump around while you're saying something.
Kind of like a drama class.
Exactly. So, like, then from a listener's perspective, does that mean, you hear certain words more? Or because someone's whispering, does it, if there's white noise or like the fridge is in the background, and then all of a sudden it stops and you all of a sudden like, wait, something.
You suddenly notice something in a different way.
Yeah. So it was kind of just to kind of hear how the different words sound, what sticks out. And so, that was one of the exercises as well.
So what was the role of the research lab in all this? I can imagine they probably provided the journal articles about eczema.
Yeah, so Sarah has a pretty hands-off approach, and the reason she wants that is because researchers and doctors are seen as sometimes intimidating, and especially in the context of eczema. I mentioned earlier that there are these flare-ups, and so a lot of people that struggle with eczema, they don't feel seen or heard, and so I think from Sarah's perspective, she doesn't want to be this GP that doesn't listen to anybody and blah blah blah. So she's just she's kind of taking a very stepped back approach, providing support where she can in terms of the funding and knowledge, I suppose. Yeah. So there's not like a physical lab part of this project. So this is
different from, for example, the glands project where the artist came into the lab and it was very all directly influencing each other.
Yeah.
So are there any future plans with this project?
So it's it's heading towards the end of the 3-year funding that we got. So Bev is working now on a text or a script that the idea will be to use that as a training resource for, I think we've identified the target audience as GPs. That seemed to come out as one of the most common people from the workshops that we ran, that people struggling with eczema wanted the GPs to be aware of. So it's maybe going to be used as like a training exercise or part of GPs training, like a 30-minute type of thing where you would read out the script, and by reading it out you maybe take on the persona of someone who has this experience, and then maybe it makes you treat your patients differently or understand them a little bit better. That's the goal, at least.
Right. So those are some of the projects that you have collaborated on with the university. Obviously, you have lots of more projects not collaborating with them. for example, the projects you had in the festival. But are there any ideas for collaborations with the university in the future, or are you just sort of packing up the festival and not thinking about that right now? Or
always thinking about future. So I mean, we consider ourselves public engagement experts. It's what we do, and we love hosting workshops and things like that. So we're always open to PIs reaching out to us to engage with them or start a collaboration. So yes, like we're always keen for that. There are no projects at the moment in the pipeline, but there are also opportunities for students to come into the lab. And that's something I'm trying to work on, is forming like a stronger relationship with the Edinburgh College of Art to get more of the students into our space to kind of see the advantage of an interdisciplinary working and creating. And yeah, there's, I mean, I think they're part of the University of Edinburgh. Yeah, so like I do kind of do talks and consultations with people about public engagement from a scientific point of view. So yeah, there's no projects in the pipeline, but we're super approachable, and like I'd love to keep working with the university because there's some really great research happening there, and it's also, I think, great for students to understand that the ASCUS Lab resource is available to anybody. So yeah. And
maybe just to close, what would be one of the lessons that you learned, working with scientists, working with artists, about how this space can change people's perspectives on what they do, whether they are an artist or versus, on the other side, a scientist?
I think it's just having an open mind. So like, I've probably learned more, maybe, I don't know. I've learned a lot, I'll put it that way. I've learned a lot from artists about science than I have from science about science. There, like, artists are very, at least in my experience, open-minded, and they ask questions that a scientist wouldn't ask. Like, the simplest questions that scientists don't know, because it's not too small of a question. It's just we don't think in that way. So I find that that's really interesting, and like the ASCUS Lab, at least, it allows that kind of those kind of questions to be asked. It's almost like you go into the space and like your mind just shifts in a way, because we try and have like this really friendly environment, and we're approachable, and that's the goal. And so I almost feel like, because that's our ethos, artists are able to be to kind of break down their insecurity of like not knowing enough or something like that. So yeah, I learn a lot from artists, and some of the work that they approach me with is just mind-boggling. I'm just like, how did you think of that? That's amazing. It's crazy, but like, let's try it. Like, that sounds really cool. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, yeah, it does. Yeah, I think we'll close it there.
Awesome.
Lots to think about, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for coming out.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of BioPOD. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on whichever platform you're listening on. You can also follow us on X at BioPOD Edinburgh, on Instagram or Facebook. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you next time.